Well, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining with me again today. Yesterday, we started talking about putting off those things that really keep us from being able to live effectively and joyfully and fulfillingly in the Christian life. I don't mean to imply by using the word joyful that everything we do turns out to make us happy, because sometimes there are real struggles and real battles that we all face. And in fact, you may be going through a season like that right now in your own life. But it's important that hard work or struggles that we go through often are valuable because of what they produce in the end. You know, I'm like that guy. I help my wife clean the house every week, and I get out and we go out and care for the yard and do a lot of these kind of things that are daily necessities. We go on walks and try to exercise and keep ourselves healthy. And I have to be quite honest, I don't particularly enjoy doing those things. I mean, I don't find that they're so much a pleasure in themselves, but the end result is always fulfilling. And that's kind of the nature of the disciplines of the Spirit in a person's life, that as we learn to adapt certain disciplines like reading and prayer and just even sometimes meditating upon the Lord, when we begin to access resources in our life, which I hope this is for you, that helps us to get refocused and recalibrated and get our eyes fixed again, as Paul said, on the prize of the high calling in Christ Jesus. The end result is that we realize that the investment of that time and energy was worthwhile, and enduring under hardships has great reward as well. It isn't so much the person who runs the fastest that always wins out in life. It's usually the person who lasts the longest. And many people I know start out really well, give up because of discouragement, despair. And I'm not trying to be critical or judgmental, because I have been, at times, I've known deep discouragement, deep despair, deep depression. I know what it feels like to be so caught up in self-pity, you can't tell the forest for the trees. That's why I'm thankful for my wife. She's kind of a realist who oftentimes brings me back to reality and tells me I'm just feeling sorry for myself, which, offends me, but it's the truth. Okay. Anyway, but it's an important thing, I think, for us to realize, because this is a battle, and when we're trying to resist certain things and put certain things on, we have to realize it's not that we're being deprived of something. Instead, it's that we're investing in something better. So the idea of sensual pleasures and satisfactions being really the reason for living and what makes life full and happy is one of those lies that comes out of the pits of hell. What makes life really fulfilling is when we know that we've done something that's good and right and true, even when it's costly. And many times it is. Many times taking a stand for what is right and true, or saying no to something that may be attractive and alluring, is maybe a conflict and a struggle, and you feel like you're missing out. But in reality, you know long term that you're going to be thankful that you didn't. I mean, I'm at that point in my life where I get that way about certain food groups, things like chocolate and candy and sweets and cakes and pies and things of that nature. And I just know that, I'm going to blow up like the Muffin Man if I give in to that. And yet, it's a denial thing. I found one of the hardest things to do is to only eat 80% of what your body tells you need to have, because if you eat 80% of what you crave and desire, you'll probably be able to keep your weight down. And I wish I said I did that all the time, but sometimes I'm willing to make the sacrifice and eat 120% of what I'm not supposed to touch. Anyway, that's my issue. I won't put that on you. But again, Paul, as he was talking about the behaviors that oftentimes we give place to, we talked about some of these things of sexual immorality and impurity and lust and having desire for evil things and even greed and other forms which he called idolatry. He goes on to say in verse 6 that because of these, the wrath of God is coming. And I love the way the NASB puts it. It says, because of this, his holy anger will come upon the sons of disobedience. Now, holy anger is one thing. Who is the sons of disobedience? And he's referring to those people who really have spawned sinfulness in their life. They've cultivated a proclivity for a kind of sinfulness in their life, in resistance to what the Spirit of God wants them to do. In other words, the Spirit of God is a regular in pointing out to me the thou shalt nots. And I find many times, sometimes I even struggle against thou shalt love thy neighbor, thou shalt forgive people of their sins, thou shalt overlook an offense. So this conflict that we have between the things we're supposed to do and the things we're not supposed to do is what we call really the rubric of temptation that we all struggle between. But he says what you have to understand is that though the rewards of sin are swift and short, they also bring swift and deep consequences. And that's why he says, because of those things, the wrath of God is coming. Now, the wrath of God is a phrase that is often been misconstrued. It kind of portrays God as being essentially a sinister and angry character, that he's looking for the opportunity just to slap you down. He's like that abusive father that you may have grown up with, or at least hopefully you only heard of. But the simple fact is that God isn't sitting there waiting to backhand you because you didn't do things quite right. In fact, he's extremely patient. He's extremely forgiving. He's really more than willing to let go of things. But he also knows that if we don't acknowledge our error in areas of our life, that we will become more deeply engrossed in them. And that's why the whole idea of the confession of sins is central to spiritual growth. Spiritual growth is not predicated on the idea of never doing anything wrong. In fact, that's impossible. I have this nature within me that is pretty powerful sometimes, and I have to battle against that. I have to resist it. But the whole point is that it's not so much the idea of never sinning, because that's impossible, but because we are willing to admit it, that when we do sin. And what keeps us from doing that is just simple pride. We don't want to admit to ourselves, and we certainly don't want to admit to other people that we are simply normal. And I think that's part of the reality that we realize when we realize that negative things begin to flow into our lives when we give place to sinful behaviors. Those things begin to become less attractive to us over time. I mean, for example, how does God's wrath express itself in our lives? Well, the first thing that we understand is the lack of intimacy with God. In other words, you begin to feel this void between you and the Lord. I remember when I was first a young Christian and I fell back into some sinful behaviors, and it was interesting because I wondered where God had gone. I felt like the Lord had left me. And this is a true story. I went out in the middle of a Berkeley High School football field. I was going to UC Berkeley at the time. And I started screaming at God, "Where are you, God? And if you're real, show yourself to me," and so forth. Because I felt this incredible absence of God in my life at that time. Again, because of some of the things I was letting into my life. And I remember as I was walking away muttering to myself saying, well, obviously, God isn't there. And this voice just penetrated my mind at that moment. I knew it was God because it hadn't come out of my cranium. And I just heard this voice that simply said, "If I'm not there, who are you yelling at?" And I suddenly realized, I just so deeply convicted, and I said, "Lord, I know it's my sin that has separated me from you. You haven't forsaken me, you haven't become my enemy, but I feel this lack of conversation between the two of us," because God basically says he's only going to communicate with us through righteousness. He's not going to communicate with us in sin. And when we sin, he just lets things fall apart in our life. So that lack of the presence of God, when we come to a place where we feel like, I just don't feel close to the Lord, always remember, God didn't move, you did. And you need to start examining yourself. What is it that I started allowing into my life that before this separation or this void came into my life, when I began to feel this distance with God? What did I let in to my life that I shouldn't have let in? And as Josh McDowell put it one time, when he said a young student came to us and says, I'm having an intellectual problem with Christianity. He said, "What's her name?" And the guy immediately admitted, "Well, I met this girl, she's not a Christian, and I want to have a relationship with her." But, basically Josh says, well, there's your problem. You have to make a choice. Are you going to follow the Lord, or are you going to pursue your own desires for intimacy with this probably very attractive, winsome young lady? I don't want to put her down. But instead of trying to lead her to Christ, he was letting himself being led away from Christ. And that's where the second thing we see happens in our life, when we've really begun to give place to the enemy, that there's a lack of blessing in our life. And I don't mean blessing in the sense of becoming rich, wealthy, and wise and getting everything you want. But blessing is something much bigger than material things. It's the sense of being in his presence. It's the sense that I'm in God's pleasure, that he's looking at me and he's finding pleasure in me, and my pleasure is being pleasing to him. And that's such an abstract concept that a non-Christian and a person who's never experienced that can't even begin to grasp what I'm talking about. But I'm telling you, it is such an intimate and wonderful thing when God says, well done, good and faithful servant. When God is saying, I'm pleased and blessed in your faithfulness and your trust and your commitment and surrender to me. It's that thing I felt the first moment I gave my life to Christ. But also there's a far worse consequence, or I should say more terminal consequence, where he basically says, thirdly, in Ecclesiastes 7:17, do not be over wicked and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? And this is the tragic reality, is some people's lives will be cut short, apparently, that they won't live out the full plan that God has for their life because they went so far away from it and sinned so egregiously against him and so destroyed their testimony that maybe they're going to get to heaven, hopefully, Lord willing, but they're not going to have the rewarded life in heaven that they could have had. Well, way over time. Let's pick this up tomorrow as we continue our conversation. God bless you and go in his grace.